Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Fairbanks Ethics Lecture Series and to introduce one of my most treasured colleagues, Richard Gunderman. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. I wondered if you would all remember to silence your cell phones and pagers, and if you need to answer a phone call, if you wouldn't mind just stepping out of the auditorium. A reminder also that the lecture is being broadcasted to IU Health West, North, Ball Memorial, and I'd like to thank them for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our program manager, Amy Chamness, who coordinates and does all of the heavy lifting for this lecture series. Richard Gunderman is, I would call him an intellectual giant, without exaggeration. And I'm actually going to read a formal introduction because it's so fun for me to read and to listen to, and I hope it'll be fun for you to listen to. This leaves out an awful lot of things, but includes a lot of really important things, so I'm just going to read a few things too. So Richard is a professor of radiology, pediatrics, medical education, philosophy, liberal arts, and philanthropy at Indiana University. I think that is the most titles in any one individual. He went to Wabash College and graduated Summa Cum Laude and got an MD and PhD from the University of Chicago. I was a student at the University of Chicago for 14 years, and I know that Richard holds the land speed record for getting through a PhD from that committee, which I think at the time was chaired by the great either Leon Cass or might have been Leon Cass at the time. So he got an honorary doctorate of Humane Letters from the Garrett Theological Seminary at Northwestern. He was the Chancellor Scholar of the Federal Republic of Germany. He's a 9-time recipient of the Indiana University Trustees Teaching Award. He was named the 2008 Outstanding Educator by the Radiological Society of North America, the 2011 American Roentgen Ray Society Berlin Scholar in Professionalism, and the 2012 Distinguished Educator of the American Roentgen Society. In 2012, he got the Alpha Omega Alpha Robert Glaser Award for Teaching Excellence, the top teaching award from the Association of American Medical Colleges. And in 2013, he spent 3 weeks as the Spinoza Professor at the University of Amsterdam just last year. Richard has written more than 400 articles and published 8 books, including a textbook that he's been the writer and editor for many years now. And he's also past president of the faculty at Indiana University School of Medicine. And in some ways, most fun, you can read him in the Atlantic Monthly, where he writes an essay about once or twice a month. And I would encourage you to go to that and read. So Richard, we're really looking for, we actually invite Richard every year with the directive to talk on anything that he wants to talk on. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much. It's a treat to be with you, and I'm delighted to be talking on, this topic was actually suggested. Audience comments the last time I had the privilege of giving a Fairbanks Ethics Series talk. Someone wrote on the post-talk comment form let's hear about sexual ethics. So I've spent the last few days putting together perhaps that person's in the room right now. I don't know, but I hope you'll find this intriguing and provocative. Anybody recognize that image? It's by a well-known 20th century painter. Anyone? Who painted this? Well, perhaps more to the point, what's the theme? Or what theme might we discern in this work of art? I think it's an important one, which has a lot to say to us about the relationship between sexuality and other spheres of our lives. I'll come back to this later. So there are lots of ways to think about sex. There are doctors in the room, scientists, health professionals, nurses, chaplains, social workers, hospital administrators. One way to think about sex is in strictly biological terms, and we've learned a lot over about the last 120 years about the neurologic and endocrinologic, and for that matter, neuroendocrinologic dimensions of sexuality. Who coined the term hormone? I'm not asking for that individual to identify herself. Wonder if anybody knows who that was. Well, it was one of the great figures in 20th century physiology who coined the term. Hormone means to push or to urge on. To urge on. Hormones have to do with urges in a certain sense, and there's no question about it. People in the room who've been through puberty, and I suspect that includes quite a significant percentage of the people gathered here this afternoon, understand that hormones do have a pretty powerful impact on human life, individually and socially and so forth. And, if we didn't understand, dihydroxyepiandrosterone or 21-hydroxylase or something, we'd be missing out on an important dimension of sexuality, not even strictly in human beings, but in other species, right? Other mammals, for example, in whom the same hormones play very significant roles. So, in part, to understand sexuality is to understand the anatomy and physiology of, our gonads and our genitalia. It would be silly to pretend that that's not so. But one problem we face today in the health professions is a tendency to focus so closely on those aspects of sexuality that sometimes we forget other dimensions of it. Sometimes we get so focused on what we can see with our biochemical assays or our microscopes or our MRI scanners that we forget that there are dimensions, whole dimensions of sexuality that aren't strictly speaking visible or measurable, at least in the same way. Another clear biological dimension, and people, the likes of Sigmund Freud have talked about it in this term, not quite the same words, but sexuality might involve something like the scratching of an itch. Maybe that's not the best metaphor, but people have this feeling, and they're moved to do something about that feeling. And that's an important part of our sexual identity. But again, and it may be very difficult, particularly for people who are just discovering themselves as sexual beings, to cope with those feelings. But returning to the term hormone, with those urges, what do I do with these feelings? What's an appropriate way of responding? What are the alternatives available? So again, the biological dimension, very important. But again, if all we understand is urges and the biochemical bases of those urges, we're missing something. Who's that? Yeah, that's Napoleon, the Emperor Napoleon. Where was he born? Yeah, on the Isle of Corsica. That's absolutely, we could say a lot about Napoleon. Somebody from really very humble origins who rose to, in essence, crown himself the emperor of France and many other dominions, many other countries in Europe. Napoleon, I think, saw sex very biologically. He was very interested in gene lines, very keen to have a male heir, and we know this from multiple accounts. Contemporaneous accounts. Napoleon would say at the end of a long day in the court or at battle, he would simply announce, "I need a woman." And it was his intention, which was always fulfilled, that a young woman would be brought to him. And she would be brought to him in a state of complete undress. Anybody know the story of who's Holofernes? Anybody know Judith? Judith and Holofernes, who are they? Well, Judith was brought to Holofernes, a ruler under similar circumstances. Turned out, she had a blade on her person, which she used to decapitate Holofernes. There's actually a famous painting of that. Anybody remember it? By Caravaggio. Judith and Holofernes. I thought about showing it, but it's around lunchtime, so I didn't. Napoleon knew that story. And one of the reasons he wanted that anonymous young woman whose name he didn't care about in the least, who he assumed and in fact hoped he would never see again, one reason he wanted her brought in that state was precisely so she couldn't pose any threat to him. What kind of sexuality is that? I need a woman. I need a man. Well, how is that even possible for human beings to utter such a thing? What does it show about our understanding of our own sexuality and the sexuality of others that any human being could ever utter such a phrase? So one more aspect of biology here is the issue of nudity. This is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. It's about the ideal proportions of a human being. But think for a minute about nudity and what that means to us. Are you most who you are when you are fully unclothed or when you are fully clothed? There's probably more than seems to be at stake in that question. Some very thoughtful people have argued over the centuries that we're in fact most who we are with our clothes on. Now, why would somebody say that? Why wouldn't it be our birthday suits? That's the most revealing garb, right? Namely, no garb. Why would anybody claim that it's when we have our clothes on that we're most who we are? Well, I tend to leave that as a little bit of a riddle now, but I encourage you to think about it. When are you most who you are? As a woman or a man? And not just as a woman or a man or the particular woman or particular man you are. When are you most distinctively yourself? What do you look like in that moment? Because until we have an answer to that question, it seems to me that we're just skirting across the surface of sexuality and not really plumbing its depths. And this is one of my major concerns and a reason that I'm delighted to have an opportunity to address this topic today. I think most of us, insofar as we're fed a diet of popular culture, are malnourished. We're operating with pretty thin gruel, with a pretty shallow conception of what human sexuality really is and ought to be, and that is a terrible handicap to go through life with. If we don't get this right, we are almost certainly out of balance, like a tire or a wheel that's out of balance. It's going to be hard to lead a fully integrated, fully harmonious life. And I worry that too often we just don't talk about these things. You know, they're awkward, uncomfortable. We have sex education in the schools. What does that mean? What would you want your 12-year-old daughter, your 14-year-old son to know about human sexuality? Would it be enough to, tell them how babies are made? Would it be enough to share with them, the stories about the birds and the bees and so forth? Or would you hope that biology, that plumbing, would be, one chapter, let's say, in a big book, a few minutes in a long series of conversations? Sometimes we let the biology so dominate our horizon that what really matters ends up getting squeezed out of the conversation. So here's one way to think about the relationship between biology and biography as it pertains to sexual ethics. Is sex an end in itself? Having had it or done it, have we done the deed? Is our work, in a sense, over? Or is, in fact, sex a means to something else? I love this diagram. This is marketing genius. There's an attribute, some tangible product feature. There are functional consequences, psychosocial consequences, and finally, value. Think about sexuality in those terms. What if you tried to fill in those ovals and the legends underneath them? I mean, that would be a fascinating exercise. If we had 90 minutes and a small group, we could think that through and figure out what belongs there. But for the moment, I think that's a fairly daunting challenge. Those categories would be difficult to fill in, but we all recognize that sex sells. How do you sell an automobile? How do you sell a can of beer? You attach it to something that has absolutely no intrinsic connection with it whatsoever, namely a comely young adult, who's visually appealing, who incites a certain kind of appetite. And if you can do that often enough, Sigmund Freud's nephew really opened our eyes to this possibility. If you can do that often enough, even though there's absolutely no intrinsic connection whatsoever, we will begin to associate the two. Our impulses will become wedded to that product, which might be a particular automobile or might be a particular brand of beer or soft drink, when in fact the two have absolutely nothing to do with each other. Here's unfortunately a big part of our conversation about sex: what you shouldn't do. She may look clean, but, right, this is a real poster from World War II intended to warn the troops about the dangers of venereal disease. What's the impact of a poster like this on the psyche of human beings who encounter it? Perhaps on the psyche of human beings who encounter it every day in a latrine. I see this poster every day. There it is. Months on end. How does that change the way I think about sexuality? What does it mean when our first lessons to our children are sometimes things like the dangers of unwanted pregnancies, the dangers of sexually transmitted diseases? What's the effect of that kind of education on the psyches of 12 and 14-year-olds? Somehow we've got it into our head that what's most important about sexual ethics is what you shouldn't do. Prohibition against sex outside of relationships, right? Extramarital sex and so forth. Don't do this, don't do that, and by the way, don't do that either. I mean, certainly there are some things we wish our spouses, our parents, and our children would refrain from. But how much of the conversation do we want to be co-opted by the things one shouldn't do? William Masters and Virginia Johnson, two of the 20th century American authorities on human sexuality. You know how they explored human sexuality? With things like, with things like rulers, right? Whatever it was they wanted to know about sexuality, you can measure it with something like a ruler or a tape measure. That's interesting. That's biology. That's perhaps even medicine. But that co-opted the conversation around human sexuality in the United States for a number of years. Alfred Kinsey, I'm on the board of the Kinsey Institute down in Bloomington. Masters and Johnson in St. Louis. The conversation was co-opted by the sorts of things you can measure with a ruler. Plumbing. Everything I needed to know about sex but was afraid to ask, it's plumbing. That's what I always wanted to know. Plumbing, right? I want to be a plumber, a good plumber. And that's what I need to know. Is that an adequate account of this dimension of human life? What does it do to a generation or two or three Americans, or for that matter, human beings, who are taught to think about human sexuality in those terms? What you're really talking about, most fundamentally, what's most real about it, is plumbing. There's a lot of stuff overlaid, the novels of Jane Austen or whatever, but deep down, it's plumbing. That's what's real. The rest is just window dressing. Is that in fact the case? You ought to read the story of Masters and Johnson. It's fascinating. Masters says to Virginia, we're observing, experimenting every night on these young college students, young adults, sexuality. This may cause us to become overcharged, overstimulated. I'm worried about that. You and I should start having our own sexual encounters on a nightly basis to ensure that, like some locomotive engine, we don't become, too steamed up and explode. When you approach sex in a certain way, that might be an entirely plausible line of argument. By the way, how did Virginia Masters react to that proposal? So far as we know, okie dokie. What about conversation in these matters? Anybody know what this image depicts? Might help to either be British or have spent some time in the British Isles. This is the process of chatting up. Anybody know what chatting up means? Usually it's the boy chatting up the girl. Not necessarily, but that would be the typical scenario. What's chatting up? What does it mean when you chat somebody up? The idea is you talk to somebody long enough and in whatever way necessary to get them interested in having sex. The conversation's a kind of prelude to what really matters, It's the price you have to pay. Sometimes you have to talk to people, sell them a car, get them into bed. It's just the way human life is. But we all know what it's really all about, not the conversation, not the words, relationships, stuff like that. At least one of the people, and perhaps both, not so interested in that. Is that in fact the case? What does a phrase in popular usage in a liberal democracy like Great Britain, chatting up, really amount to? We should do more conversational biopsies. You may not be a pathologist. You may not know how to stain a thinly sliced piece of tissue with hematoxylin and eosin. You may not have any, training in distinguishing between a squamous cell and an adenocarcinoma. But everybody in the room is fully qualified to do conversational biopsies. And we need to do a lot more conversational biopsies. Pay attention to what you hear said, either directly focused on or a near miss concerning human sexuality, and see what you can infer about the speaker, the listener, about our culture from the way we talk about these matters. So what is that image? Anybody recognize it? It's les amants. Anybody know French? What? The lovers, les amants. And it was painted by René Magritte. The lovers. Are these people lovers? Now, some people might say, well, I can't tell. You got to pan down. If you'd lower the camera about 10 degrees, then I could tell you. Right now, not enough information. Any eye. Just move the camera a little bit and I'll answer your question. Is that what it means to be a lover? I don't know if you know this. This is a true story. When Masters and Johnson started doing their sex research at Washington University, St. Louis, they initially had all their subjects put a bag over their head because they wanted to keep those encounters anonymous. The young women, the young men, they had bags over their heads. They couldn't see one another's faces, which, is beautiful because it purifies what's really going on, right? No more distractions. You don't have to worry so much about preserving anonymity because with bags over our heads, we all look pretty much alike, right? There is a man. There is a woman. That's all I need to know, right? Is that true? That's a true story. Masters and Johnson had people with bags over their heads, perhaps to preserve anonymity, but perhaps that makes an important statement about how they understood human sexuality, what they thought they were investigating. So, what's this guy doing? Anybody recognize? I'm giving you a hint right now. Anybody recognize what this guy's doing? Come on, somebody does. What is he? In a word or two, what does this guy do for a living? Yeah, he's a tea taster. That's absolutely right. He tastes teas. he takes a swig of tea, swishes it around in his mouth, inhales the aroma immediately, and then spits it out. C.S. Lewis said, people who think sex is what it's all about are like tea tasters. They imbibe something and then spit it back out. They get no nourishment from it, humanly speaking. He may have been wrong by that, but that's an interesting statement, isn't it? Somebody who wants to have sex just to have sex is like a tea taster. They're not getting any of the nourishment that activity is meant to make possible. Was he right about that? Clive Staples, Lewis, Oxford Don, 20th century, Chronicles of Narnia, right? Paralandra, Out of the Silent Planet, Mere Christianity. Was he right about that? It's an intriguing hypothesis. Here's my theory. The probability that we will misuse our sexuality is directly proportional to the probability that we misunderstand our sexuality. And I don't know about you, but I consider myself still somebody who misunderstands sexuality, but who's managed to get a little clearer on a few questions than I was when I was 14 and 18 and 22 years old. By the way, when does a man reach his sexual peak? Anybody know? Anybody know when does a man, how would you define sexual peak? I bet you could guess how Masters and Johnson would describe sexual peak. Is that what we would say? Do we have any alternative count? When does a woman reach her sexual peak? How would you define that? What do you mean by that? I think the very idea of defining that reveals some kind of serious misunderstanding. But then the way we've gone about doing so, the kind of measurements we've employed to come up with those figures, represent a serious misunderstanding of the very phenomenon they purport to describe. For some of us, one of the most important dimensions in our lives, seriously misconstrued. And insofar as we misunderstand these matters, we may end up leading lives that aren't what they could have been had we been clearer on this. What are healthcare human sexuality? It's an important part of human health. What are we doing to foster conversations among health professionals, chaplains, social workers, nurses, doctors, patients, family members around these themes? Well, I don't want to talk about that, right? Well, who is going to foster those conversations? Where will our children and grandchildren learn about human sexuality and its role in their lives? What will shape their sense of what sexual ethics at its best looks like? If we don't have those conversations, where's that going to come from? Do healthcare organizations have any responsibility for fostering those kind of discussions? Well, that's too hot. I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. There's some uncomfortable things that may need to be talked about for the benefit of our patients, our communities. So this is a nice picture depicting an event described in the 7th book of Homer's Odyssey, one of the great, epic poems of human civilization. This is Ares and Aphrodite. Hephaestus, you see him on the right, has gotten word that his wife, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is involved in an illicit extramarital affair with the god of war, Ares. So he set a trap. And only Hephaestus could do this, but he's hammered out a kind of gossamer web that when the two are together in their embrace of love, descends on them and traps them. And then Hephaestus summons the other gods to come and see. You know? You know what the other gods do? They laugh. Sometimes we take these things too seriously. I don't mean marital infidelity. I mean sexuality. I have a feeling that some of us have lost our capacity to laugh about these matters. And one thing Homer's pointing out to us is that, among other things, human sexuality has a profoundly amusing or humorous dimension, at least looked at from a certain point of view. The unquenchable laughter flowed from the deathless gods. You know, we run some risk if we take these matters too seriously and can't sometimes step back and chuckle. I don't mean at other people, I mean at ourselves, insofar as our sexuality isn't necessarily the embodiment of our prowess or something. It's also the embodiment of our fallibility or vulnerability, our capacity to be ashamed or embarrassed. And it seems to me that one appropriate response to that is something like laughter now and then. So here are two towering figures of the 20th century. Maybe you've seen Freud's Last. Anybody know? Arnold Nicolai at Harvard University. Freud's Last Interview. Anyway, it's a kind of fanciful conversation between Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis. Freud on the left, Lewis on the right. Big difference between these two people. On the one hand, our desires are meant to be satisfied. Sigmund Freud, we have these desires so that they can be satisfied. C.S. Lewis, we have these desires so that they can be educated. The desires we're born with, just like the knowledge, the capacity for speech that we're born with, isn't all it's meant to become. We are in fact called as human beings to take those desires and help them develop into something bigger, better, truer, more beautiful than what we were born with. Either at the moment of our birth or, our first days in puberty. Those desires are meant to be something more than they are as they're given to us. And one of our challenges as human beings is to help them develop in that direction. That's what C.S. Lewis thought. You might disagree with him, but it's an intriguing possibility. Are we Freudian? Do we see these impulses, libido, as Freud would say, as something simply given, immutable, unalterable, or do we see those as something pointing beyond themselves, asking to be developed and shaped into something more than what it was at first? Well, this is a big idea. It goes way back. Plato's Symposium, one of the greatest dialogues by the greatest writer of philosophy who ever lived, Plato. In the Symposium, which means drinking party, he talks about how human beings used to be these round creatures with 4 arms and legs and 2 sets of genitalia. And then at one point, we were split in half, and now all of us go wandering over the face of the earth trying to find our other half. That's the speech of Aristophanes, the great Greek comic dramatist in Plato's Symposium. He's on to something. You and I most of us do feel incomplete. We need someone else to complete ourselves, to feel whole, even if only for a period of time. Alone, we're not all we're supposed to be. I think that's a beautiful depiction of human incompleteness and our desire to find someone else to share our lives with. Because we're only half creatures. But that's not the whole story, because there's also the biblical metaphor. What's the biblical metaphor for sex? What euphemism does, say, the book of Genesis employ again and again? To lie with is one. Yeah, the one I was thinking of, and there are more, but to know. What if we said that all the time? I want to have sex with you. I want to lie with you. I want to know you. I want you to know me. What, is there any difference there? I personally, this is Rembrandt's, right, sketch of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, the original woman and man. Adam knew that he wasn't meant to be alone, that he somehow wasn't whole, wasn't complete. He needed somebody else. Perhaps, I'll have to defer to some of the people in the room. Eve felt the same. I'm not sure. But knowing. What would that mean? Knowing your partner, knowing your wife or husband, knowing the father or mother of your children. What if we said our deepest aspiration is somehow to know? Would that change the way we think about these matters? In my view, the answer is a resounding probably yes. We operate with many defective metaphors. It was 10, 15 years ago, you'd hear high school and junior high students really talk about hooking up. What's hooking up mean? On the one hand, I want to hook up with you. On the other hand, I want to know you. Now, you might say, just, euphemisms. They're synonyms. There's no difference. But maybe that is a difference. Maybe that's a difference that really makes a difference. To what have we tied or entrained our discussions about matters sexual in the larger spheres of our lives? So there's our old friend Socrates, Jean-Louis David's The Death of Socrates. Socrates seems to have thought, in a way perhaps like C.S. Lewis, that our capacity for sex is tied to our capacity to love, and our capacity to love is tied to our capacity to become fully human. And that somehow we were supposed to be on the ascent, in effect moving from some lower things to some higher things, helping lower things perhaps develop into higher things. What? Does that make sense to us? If so, how? How effectively could you and I articulate that? Your 12-year-old daughter, your 14-year-old son, your 8-year-old daughter or son ask you one of those questions. How are you going to respond? We shouldn't talk about that now. Leave me alone. Can't you see I'm busy? We'll talk about it later. You don't need to know about that. Where did you hear about that, right? You're in trouble. You shouldn't mention things like that in my presence. I'm coming down on you like a house of bricks, right? How do we handle these matters? How could we at our best handle these matters? I think a lot of it has to do not so much with our discomfort with the plumbing, but our deep sense of embarrassment that we don't know how the plumbing fits into those higher dimensions of learning to love and, let's say, becoming fully human. And if we could figure out how those fit together, I think our capacity to talk about these matters would be enriched in a way that might help us enrich the lives of other people. So, anybody recognize this image? By the greatest poet-artist in the English language. Dante is a good thought, but no. It's William Blake. William Blake's portrayal of Jacob's ladder. Remember, Jacob has to leave home. He's got nothing. I mean, he's got the birthright. He's got the blessing. But in fact, he's got nothing. And he has to put his head down on a stone. And he puts his head down and he dreams of a stairway to heaven, right? Led Zeppelin. Or a ladder leading from the earth to the heavens. And he sees creatures ascending and descending on that ladder. What if those creatures aren't angels? What if those creatures are meant to be us? We're supposed to be on that ladder. Maybe you've known something like lust. an impulse to be satisfied, or perhaps a summons to intimacy. Maybe you've known intimacy, a satisfied impulse, or perhaps a summons, a calling to something else that, for lack of a better term, I'll call friendship. What do you really long for, with your significant other, your husband or wife? Is it the satisfaction of lust or the realization of friendship, a certain kind of love? So, anybody recognize this sculpture? It's in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Who was born in Northern Ireland? C.S. Lewis again. So this is an artist depiction of C.S. Lewis entering the wardrobe. What wardrobe? Anybody know? What wardrobe? Closet? So what? Anybody know? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. People like J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, right? That series is coming out in cinemas now. People like G.K. Chesterton, who wrote books like Orthodoxy, for example. People like C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia. They seem to have thought, and in fact said as much, that human sexuality is not a destination. Human sexuality is a gateway. Everybody likes to go to the gate. It's an interesting place to be. But some of us stay at the gate. Some of us linger at the gate our whole lives and never pass through it. And in their opinions, we're called to pass through that gate. Not to lay aside our sexuality, but for it to become drawn up into something beyond it, to become a part of something even bigger. And one of my major concerns, I think one of the problems we face in the early part of the 21st century in the United States and liberal democracies in general, is real difficulty talking about what that higher, bigger whole that encompasses sexuality might be. It's difficult to talk about, and so young people end up thinking that, boy, that sexuality must be all that there is. We don't want to spend our whole lives on this side of that gateway. We want our children and grandchildren to get to the other side, to whatever sexuality can serve as a gateway to. Now, one of those things, and only one of those things, and I'm not trying to say we should all have children, but one example of something that might lie on the other side of that gateway might be the family. For many people in the room, the challenge to be a good wife or husband, a good spouse, the challenge to be a good mother or father, might be one of the best challenges we ever get in life in terms of developing into the human beings we're supposed to be. Caring for other people in the way we're really capable of. That's a big challenge, a scary challenge, but also a marvelous opportunity. And that might be one way to think about how sexuality might lead to something bigger than itself. The birds and the bees. One result of that kind of activity, at least in some cases, is new human beings who wouldn't have been on the scene otherwise. And these new human beings turn out to need a lot of attention, time, energy, economic resources, and above all, love. If they're going to become the kind of people they could be. This is Henry Moore's sculpture, right? The family unit. So we're coming to the end. There are only 5 slides, I think, to go. This is how I see sex when I go to the grocery store. The village pantry. When I encounter sex, I see it in these terms. This is quite recent. You can tell it's timely. Sex Olympics, 17 hot tricks to go for the gold. I'm 15 years old. I'm 17 years old. I'm 35 years old. I'm 50 years old. I'm 85 years old. Every time I go through the supermarket checkout line, in the upper left-hand corner of the front cover of Cosmopolitan, I see something, 47 sex tricks, Like this is some kind of, gymnastic acrobatic competition, 47 different ways to score. Is that what we want, Our brothers and sisters, our sons and daughters, our granddaughters and grandsons to think about these matters? It creates the impression that sexuality is something we do, well or poorly. How's your technique? Do you have good technique or bad technique? What would you need to do to improve your technique? That says sex is something we do. What if sex, above all, is not something we do, but something we are or are called to become? It's not a matter of doing, but a matter of being. Sex tricks? I don't think so. There's something missing in that kind of account. So I want to close with 4 questions about sexual ethics that I hope you'll be moved to ponder. They're pretty simple, but each one of them is meant to serve as a gateway for thinking about human sexuality and, some other realm into which it might lead us. Other dimensions of our lives that it might direct us toward if we understood it for what it really is. And then I'll stop. So there's Cosmo again, 60 sex tips. These badass moves involve a naughty twist you'll both love. I don't know what those are, but I wish my wife were here today because she could tell you, I don't have many badass moves. I'm not even sure I know what a badass move is, but I'm pretty sure I ain't got it. What is great sex? What exactly does that mean to you? Great sex. Right? The magazines are plastered with great sex tips. How to have great sex tonight. Surprise him with great sex. What does that mean? What exactly do we mean by great sex? What would you want your 19-year-old daughter or son to think and feel about great sex? I don't think many of us know, but I think all of us are capable of getting a whole lot clearer on that than we currently are. And I would suggest, as a hint, I may be wrong about this, that seeing sexuality in a larger context, embedded in something bigger and in a way higher than the sex itself, is really the only way to answer that question. Anything else that purports to be great sex is like tea tasting, coffee tasting. You spit it out in the end, right? That's not what we want for our children, and it's not what we want for ourselves. Question number 2, how do you bring your sexuality fully to life? Maybe sometimes it's, dormant or quiescent or, asleep. At other times, it's fully alive, fully engaged, fully energized. What does that mean? Could we tell by photographing you whether it's fully engaged? Would the camera have to pan down to answer that question? What if I told you the answer to that's no? What if I told you the answer to that is very strongly no? That we don't have to pan down to see the degree to which our sexuality has come fully to life. That you don't have to focus on what Monty Python called the naughty parts to answer that question. And in fact, the impulse to do so would only reveal how seriously we've misunderstood the very thing we're trying to get clear on. Number 3 of 4. Here's our old friend Socrates again. In making love, right? Love making. You don't see that on the cover of Cosmopolitan very often, but love making love, does love remake us? We think we make love. What if I told you that in reality, at its best, love makes us? How's that for a way of thinking about sexuality? Not making love, but being made by love. What would that mean? How would you pursue that? How would you put that into practice in a relationship? And here's the last one. At our best, what do we aspire to be sexual? Anybody recognize this image? It's by Rembrandt. It's often called the Jewish Bride. But, those two people are kind of pyramid. They've built something. They've built something that isn't primarily revealed in nudity. Whatever it is going on between them, it's not of a pornographic nature. But I would suggest to you that it's a profoundly sexual nature. They're bringing out each other's fullest identity as human beings. In this case, a woman and a man. What do we aspire to be? Up in the penthouse, 24/7, 365? With nubile young bodies? Maybe. But perhaps we're capable of more than that. Perhaps that kind of ascent up to the penthouse is in fact a descent away from what that dimension of our biology and our biography is really meant to be. Why did I call this biology and biography? Because we're so centered on the biology that I think we forget the biography. What is our story in these matters? What story are we capable of telling the people we care for, our patients, our colleagues? What would we tell our own spouse? What would we tell our own children about these matters? I think if we can get clearer on this, if we can tell a better story, a more beautiful story, a truer story about what the sexual dimension of our life really means in the context of a life well lived, it will spill over into other spheres of our lives that aren't even sexual in any sense. And on the other hand, if we get that wrong, if we persist with our pretty serious misunderstandings, we and the people we care for and the children and grandchildren we raise stand to suffer. So I think sexual ethics is actually a far more important topic than it might appear to be at first glance. And, it's an opportunity for us as health professionals, as a healthcare organization, to try to clear up some of the misunderstanding and get us all on a firmer footing. All right, I'm going to stop there now. Paul, I tried to leave a little time. It's quite possible nobody will say a word on this subject, but it may just be stony silence. But please, sir, would you say your name and something about yourself, unless you don't want to? Great. Thanks for being here. Why do we get this so wrong? I don't know, but I've done a few biopsies, and I've tried to closely scrutinize the tissue. In this case, the words, the conversations, the images that I think flood our culture. And I think it's a very complicated question. I'm going to give you one very impolitic thread of the full tapestry of an answer. Namely, we live in a society, and I want you to know human life wasn't always this way, where the buying and selling of things occupies a very important position in daily life. And it's turned out that sex sells. If you see that image often enough of that good-looking person draped over the hood of that automobile, you are, whether you know it or not, whether you can give any rational account of it or not, many of us are going to go buy that car. And so I think we are exposed every day to dozens, hundreds, perhaps even thousands of, I shouldn't say this, but base and distorted images of the meaning of human sexuality, because it's quite convenient to the nice people who do marketing. We have a marketing department in this organization. You have one in yours. They're not using the sexuality, don't get me wrong. But the field of marketing, broadly speaking, they're all the stepchildren, or the step-parents of Lucian Freud. I referred to him earlier. They are taking full advantage of the fact you can move merchandise. We've got to move these refrigerators. We've got to move these color TVs. And sex turns out to be one terrific lubricant in getting those things moving. And I think at least we want to be aware of that, a little bit suspicious of that, and perhaps some of us in a certain sense even want to talk about it. In a small way, speak out against it. I mean, our whole economy depends on fanning the flames of consumer demand, to a red-hot level. It would be un-American to say, gee, I don't really need that car. I don't really need that soft drink or that beer or whatever it might be. Maybe we don't want to go there. But at the very least, we want to recognize how pervasive that force is in our culture and how it might, in a very insidious, almost subliminal way, be reshaping our sensibilities about one of the most intimate and, I would say, meaningful dimensions of our lives. So thanks, Tom. Other questions or comments? Yes, please. Lexi. Okay, so the question is, we may have passed through a sexual revolution. We think we're all sexually liberated now, or at least more so than we used to be. Is that, in fact, the case? I think the answer is no. We've managed to disengage copulation from reproduction. We've managed to protect ourselves from, a number of diseases, let's say. Unwanted pregnancy, thanks to our understanding of biology, medicine, not the threat it used to be. Sexually transmitted diseases, well, we know how they're transmitted, and we can take steps to either ensure that they aren't transmitted further or cure them, or at least hold them in abeyance. We know a lot more now than we did in 1960, let's say, before the oral contraceptive pill was introduced. But in terms of the kind of conversation we've had today, I'm not sure we understand any more than people did in 1950 or 1880 or 1500. Insofar as, let's say that, and I'm not trying to push a particular faith perspective here, not at all. Insofar as the biblical metaphor of knowing jars us, seems unfitting, inappropriate, we may have actually lost ground. We may face a bigger challenge than people did in the 1950s because we're kind of smug and arrogant. Yes, we're the children of the sexual revolution. We've passed through, the Victorian prudery, and here we are in all our glory. we may, in fact, be less likely to recognize what we don't really know than people who hadn't lived through the sexual revolution were in years past. Well, I see it's 1 o'clock, but I know this is off the beaten track. I apologize to anybody I've offended. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but I really think these are matters we need to discuss, and one way to foment a discussion is to speak in somewhat provocative terms. And I hope you found that engaging and something you might think about or even talk about in the days ahead. By the way, I'm an eager conversation partner on these matters. I think we really need to think and talk more about them. So thanks a lot for coming.